I think the main lesson that other countries could learn is that it's worth privatizing. That has been a major benefit, primarily in terms of greater efficiency. So we've got much lower costs in the industry, there's been more investment, quality of services improved, and prices, I think, although they have increased for other reasons, are lower than they otherwise would have been. So I think the major lesson to learn is that it is worth privatizing, it is worth coping with some of the problems that involves, because that leads ultimately to a better outcome for customers. Well, obviously it helps if there is the possibility of price reductions following on privatization. And that, fortunately, was one of the benefits that we could bring in the UK. The costs of running the industry fell really quite dramatically. Over 10 years, the manpower in that industry fell by about 2/3, which is a quite incredible and very unexpected outcome. So that was one of the benefits that we could bring. And secondly, improvements in quality of service that the regulator could insist upon in the regulated monopolies. That was again another benefit that could be pointed to, and to bring customers to understand that this was in fact a better way of running the industry. I would say that in addition to privatization, the major thing the government should be thinking about at the outset is the structure of the industry in future. It ought to be taking the opportunity to restructure the industry in such a way as to create many more entities than there typically are in a publicly owned monolithic industry. And the reason for that is twofold. One is to ensure that lots of generating companies, for example, can compete with each other. Then you get the benefits of competition. Secondly, even in those networks that have to be regulated, the more you have of them, the better the regulator is able to compare how well each one is run and to see which have the lowest costs. And that information can be used to regulate more effectively, again for the benefit of customers. There has been quite a lot of discussion over time as to how many generators or distribution companies you need. In the UK, the outcome of privatization was 3 separate generators, and it pretty soon became clear that that wasn't sufficient. Some academics did studies saying that 6 generators would be sufficient for competition. I encouraged these companies to divest some of their plant. New entrants came in. We now have 6 fairly large generators, but 2 or 3 dozen smaller generators, so that over time, I think one has to work towards at least 6, but preferably more generators. In terms of distribution companies, we started with 12 in England and Wales, plus 2 in Scotland. That was certainly enough for comparative purposes, but there were mergers, I think reflecting potential economies of scale. There were takeovers, mergers. We're now down to 4 main groups, and that is proving sufficient for comparative purposes. Well, one of the things you need to do is to be able to argue effectively for lower prices and lower costs. And the companies, of course, will say, we can't do this. So the best way you can do that is by looking at what other companies are doing and saying, but they have lower costs, why can't you have lower costs too? So some form of comparative competition using data from other companies becomes increasingly important. So that, I think, is one approach. The other is to try to get the customers working with the companies and the companies working with the customers rather than against each other. So we could talk about this notion of customer engagement, which is proving increasingly effective in the UK. Yes, it certainly has evolved, and amongst other things, it's got more complicated. But let's start with the initial situation. You need evidence of what other companies are doing in order to make an argument for a tighter price control. And in the UK, in contrast to North America typically, the price controls are set looking forward for, say, 5 years, so that you have to make a judgment about how much lower costs could be in 5 years' time, how much investment is going to be needed over the next 5 years. All of that requires a lot of expert input, and it requires the ability to compare companies. So that is one thing. But then you find a situation where the regulator and the companies might differ very considerably over what investment is needed, for example. So a second development was the concept of menu regulation, where you offer companies a choice. Either do what the regulator wants or do what you want yourself, what you would prefer to do, but you may have a tougher challenge in terms of cost of capital. And then third, we have various additional incentives being built in now to provide an incentive on the companies to try to understand what customers want and to respond more quickly and to innovate more rapidly than they otherwise would. So that is underway at the moment. And the fourth development that I would stress is the notion of customer engagement, where you actually get customers as part of the decision-making process, not merely waiting to be told what the outcome will be. What regulators have typically found is that companies will be resisting on the one hand, saying what you're proposing is too difficult. Customers, on the other hand, will be shouting at the regulator saying you should go further and have lower prices. What the regulators are now doing is encouraging the companies and the customers to sit in the same room together and to talk to each other so that the companies can understand better what the customers want. The customers can understand better what the companies can and can't do. And what we've found in the UK is that with a little bit of guidance from the regulator, for example, on matters like cost of capital or on the potential for efficiency improvements, with that kind of guidance, the companies and their customers have been able to negotiate a satisfactory business plan that provides more of the things that customers want than they otherwise would have got. So this is leading to a new dynamic, a new enthusiasm on the part of companies and customers to work together. And it's facilitating, it's easing regulation. Yes, it's absolutely right to say that large companies, large customers can negotiate more effectively from a position of greater knowledge, and they have more at stake. The question then is how you extend this concept to potentially a couple of million residential customers of an electricity network or a water company, for example. What was done in Scotland is that the company and the regulator and the main customer group in Scotland formed a concept known as the Customer Forum. It had a constitution, and it specified the kind of members that it would have on the part of the customers. And so they would be customer agencies, local authority, Chamber of Commerce people, but also members of the public who had an active and long-standing interest in customers, including a couple of university people, a couple of former employees of the industry. And these people then were chosen, and their prime task was to find out what customers really wanted, what customers thought about the industry and quality of service, and then to convey that view both to the regulator and to the company. And that worked very effectively. In the case of Scotland, the forum was funded by the regulator, but in the case of England and Wales, the regulator there asked the companies to fund these bodies. So the precise method of funding, I think, is worth further discussion. We haven't yet found perhaps the ideal method, but the funding hasn't been the prime obstacle. The idea is that once companies and customers realize they can fruitfully talk together, that is the key thing. I don't think there is a simple key to finding an equitable balance between different interest groups. But one thing that I do notice quite strongly is that the more the regulator tries to do, the more these interest groups jump in and argue for their preferred way of proceeding. So the more the regulator tries to do, the more difficult the regulator makes his or her job. So I would say restrict as far as possible the amount that the regulator thinks the regulator ought to be doing. It's very difficult to identify an ideal relationship between government and regulator. The relationship that I worked under was where the government was very hands-off. The government had no power to direct the regulator, had no power to advise the regulator. The regulator was entirely independent. The regulator made his or her own decisions according to statutory criteria. The regulator didn't report to the government or to the minister. The regulator reported to Parliament. That, in my view, worked very well. It didn't preclude the regulator and the minister talking to understand each other's perspectives, and that, it seemed to me, worked very well. Over time in the UK, we've had a situation where the government has felt more and more concerned to implement an energy policy of its own, and it's wanted regulatory assistance in this. So there have been more and more obligations on the regulator to work with the government to carry out government policy and so on. I think at the moment this hasn't caused serious problems. What we find is the government carrying out its own energy policy and doing things itself. That, I think, could be leading to more tensions than we've had in the past.